day of the workshop Porul, this thing called literature. Today's session is by Professor David Shulman. A couple of announcements before we begin. Everybody, please keep your mics on mute till the end of the session. The question and answer session will be at the end of Professor Shulman's talk. And any questions that you have, you can either unmute yourselves and ask them or put it in the chat box. There will also be the link for the certificate shared in the chat box at the end of this session. I would now like to invite Professor Shulman to begin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niranjana. And thank you again to Ipshita and to everybody who was involved in this invitation. I'm very happy to be with you. It's nice to see some of the same little black rectangles that I saw yesterday. And I wanted to ask you, I have a request. I would like you, if possible, to activate your video so that I'm not looking at these black holes, you know? We're reading poetry today. I can't do it with a black hole. I need to see real faces, you know? So if you can, and if it doesn't impinge upon your connection, the internet connection, yeah, please activate the video, okay? That's better. Already I'm seeing some faces. That's a big improvement. There's just another thing I want to say. Niranjana said that the questions and answers would be at the end, but actually this is an interactive session. So, and we're reading poems. And that means I'm very keen on hearing your way of understanding a poem and your way of reading the poems that you're going to see on the screen in just a moment. That matters much more to me than saying the various things that I have to say. I mean, I'm here to help you read these poems if you need my help. The truth is, I don't think you really need the help. These poems speak for themselves. We're going to try a little experiment along those lines in just a moment. So that means that, you know, if I ask for a response or ask you a question, you can send an answer on the chat, which I should be able to see, or you can simply unmute your microphone and then ask or respond or whatever. Okay, I'd like that. It's much better like that. I suppose we'll have time towards the end for actual questions and answers in a maybe more regular way of doing things. But this should be a kind of conversation with you, okay? All right. All right, so let's begin. I'm going to need the handout, so to speak, which requires no hands, but eyes. Okay, there it is on the screen. Okay, so we're going to be reading some poems today, and I'm going to begin with a poem that I think you can read and understand and identify with, perhaps, without any other information. I was asked to speak today about the Tamil grammar of poetry. I use the word grammar just as I did yesterday, because it's not only language, morphology, syntax, phonology that requires a grammar, but poetry and literature also can have a grammar. In fact, they usually have some kind of grammar, but the Tamil case is unusual because the grammar, which is very old, from the very beginning of Tamil poetry, in what we call the Sangam period, that grammar is particularly rich, richly articulated, set down in the ancient book called the Tolkapiam, and it really is a kind of language of its own, so that if you know that language of the Tamil poets, you're able to bring to reading a poem or hearing a poem, really these poems were meant to be heard, you're able to bring to that experience a kind of expressive response, but you don't always need it. And really, you know, a poem should speak for itself. You really should not have to come to a poem with a huge apparatus of all kinds of technical knowledge. You really should not. A poem that requires so much a priori knowledge is usually not a very good poem. So here, let's read this first poem. This is a Sangam poem. It's actually a very well-known one. Some of you may know it. By the way, I'm sure there are quite a few among you who speak Tamil. Is that right? Do you have any idea how many? Maybe 20, 30, something like that? Any idea?
Not that, I mean, from amongst our students, we don't have too many people.
Oh,
At the
okay.
moment, I think we have just one.
Oh, I see.
But
Okay.
we have people from elsewhere also. So we don't really know how many of them. If
I
any,
see.
I mean, like,
Okay.
okay, there will be though. I think there are.
Okay.
There are some.
Okay.
Mhm.
I was just curious because I'll also recite or sing some of the poems because you need to
Yes.
hear
Yeah.
the
I mean,
sound of it.
that's one. Okay, let's go.
Okay, yeah, no, you need to hear the sound of it. And in fact, this is another thing, not only these poems, but maybe all poetry, good poetry, it exists on the level of sound, maybe even before it has a intelligible meaning. You have to hear the sound. It's almost enough to hear the sound, in fact. But that doesn't mean we're not going to translate. You have to, I mean, I'm going to provide you translations. The translation always reduces the original sound patterns in some way. Okay, enough said. So I'll recite the poem first, and then we'll read it, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. By the way, I also want to say, we're not running and rushing anywhere. We have time today. We don't have to read all the poems that are on the handout. It's not a matter of quantity. It's a matter of somehow entering into that world and seeing how it works and what it does to us, okay? Okay, here's the poem. It's a love poem. Sudar Silvanan Shippa Padar Kurunde Yellaru Porudin Mullai Marum Malayan Manar Mayangi Ore Kurumi Korin Neruna Hariambum Perum Pular Vidialum Malai Pagalum Malai Tuna Ilorke. You can see it's a short little verse. It comes from an anthology called the Kurundohai. Kurundohai has 400 poems that are like this, very short. And in general, Sangam poems in Tamil, they tend to be very short and laconic, maybe a little elliptical. Actually, what they don't say, the silence of the poem, is usually more important than what they do say. So here is the translation. The sun departs. The sky turns red. The ache becomes sharp. Light fades. The jasmine blooms. That's what everyone calls evening. And they're all wrong. When the cock crows in the wide town and night turns to dawn, that too is evening. Even high noon is evening for the lonely. Okay. Am I right that you can understand this poem and let it ring somehow inside of your mind or your feeling without any kind of grammatical knowledge? This is a poem which I've read with many audiences, and usually everybody responds to it because, if I may say so, I think all of us, that is all of you, me, all of us have had this experience of being lonely. And probably all of us have the experience of being lonely for someone that we love who is not there. Am I right that the poem somehow speaks to you? Maybe give a signal. You have on Zoom, I think there's a way for you to signal that. Ah, okay, good. Even high noon is evening for the lonely. Okay. Again, I want to say, you don't really need any more information. But there are a few things that I can tell you about the poem which might be interesting to you. So first of all, I've already said to you it's a love poem. No surprise. It belongs to the category called Aham, the inner category. And you've read A.K. Ramanujan's afterword to his volume of translations, I believe. So you know that old Tamil poetry divided the entire world into two categories, the inner world, Aham, and the outer world, Puram. Aham, the world of love, love relationships, and Puram, which is the world of battle, war, kingship, but also the world of philosophical thought and renunciation. We're only going to be looking at Aham poems today. So it's a love poem. Who is speaking? Anybody want to tell me who is speaking here? Don't be shy, please, because we want to do this together somehow. Who is speaking? What do you think? Is it a male or a female voice?
A male?
Actually, it's a female voice. It could be a male voice because, as I just said, all of us have the same experience. But actually, I can tell you for sure, it's a female voice. I know that because this poem has a colophon that is a very short little inscription at the editors of the poem, the ancient editors, we're talking about something like the 4th century AD. The ancient editors added these little notes at the end of the poem, and they tell you who is speaking. So it's a woman, and she is talking about a sense of absence, and the person who is absent is her lover. Now, where is she? So here's a little piece of information I can give you. Again, I want to say you don't really need that information, but I'm going to give it to you anyway, okay? Because you're going to need it later on. She's in a kind of hilly region. These are the hilly pasture lands. And there's a way that we know this. We know it because of a single word. There's one word in this poem which tells us that we're in the pasture lands. And that's the word jasmine, mullai. Because, as you can see on the right-hand side of the handout, the Tamil world has been divided by the poets into 5 landscapes. They're called Tinai. You read about this, I hope, in the Ramanujan afterward, but let's just quickly look at them, okay? We'll quickly go through them. Each landscape is correlated to a particular phase in the love relationship between, usually it's between a man and a woman, usually because not always the case, but usually. So there are 5. There's Kurinji, the mountain region, and the phase of the love relationship is called Kalavi, stolen love. Actually, what happens in the Kurinji region is that the hero and the heroine, the Talaivan and the Talaivi, meet for the first time and fall in love. The heroine, she's a young girl usually, maybe 15 or 16 years old. She's guarding the millet fields, that is by chasing away the birds that come and eat the growing grain. So she's sitting out on a little platform in the millet fields, and the Talaivan, the male, he's a hunter, and he turns up, he's out on the hills hunting, and he sees her. Actually, they see one another, and they fall in love. And quite rapidly, they consummate this love. They make love. It's a premarital love. It's a stolen love, kalavi. And I'm sorry to have to tell you that these are the only truly happy moments in their entire lives. And it doesn't last very long either. After the Kurinji moment of Kalavi, what we have is a long series of states of separation and longing and frustration and pain, of varying intensities. That follows a traditional scheme, which is built into the Tamil grammar of love. Okay, now let's look at the second Tinai, Mulai. Mulai, I just said to you, it's the region of the pasture lands and the hills. Our poem belongs to that because Mulai, each Tinai is named after a flower. Mulai means jasmine, and it's there in the poem. If you look in the second line of the Tamil, Mulai malarum, the jasmine is blooming. You see, it's enough for a reader, a listener to one of these Tamil poems to hear that word Mulai, to know that the situation is one of what is called irrittal, patient waiting. That is, usually it's the heroine. And as I say, they've consummated their love, but the lover has disappeared. Where is he? Perhaps he's not gone very far. He might be in his village, which is only maybe 2 or 3 kilometers away. We don't know, but he doesn't come to see her anymore. And she's waiting patiently. Patient loving means it's not so easy. There's pain involved, but it's a kind of bearable pain. But she feels longing for him. Why doesn't he come? She doesn't understand why he doesn't come. She speaks to her girlfriend and she complains and asks, why hasn't he stopped coming? You know, and you have to bear in mind that there are 2 families involved in this relationship, and the families actually don't know anything about the love relationship. They don't know, it's a secret relationship, right? So if the love relation were to advance to the state of, let us say, a marriage, it would involve a whole kind of sociology, would it not? That hasn't happened. That hasn't happened. Okay. Let's go to the next Tinai, Nedal, the seashore. Here again, we're in a landscape of separation. It's called Irangal, impatient waiting. You can see that things have kind of gotten worse for the poor Talaivi. I don't know, he may have gone away, the lover. Because usually in these poems, the lover, he's kind of torn between the love for the heroine, which is a real love, and between the need to make himself someone or to find the means of a livelihood, to go in search of work and money. Nedal, we'll read a Nedal poem in just a minute, and you'll see that there's a very intense form of longing, viraha in Sanskrit, right? Pirivu in Tamil, separation. And then we reach the landscape of Palai, the wilderness or the desert. We'll need it later today. Palai is the landscape of ultimate separation. The lover, the male lover, he's gone. He's crossing the wilderness. He's left his beloved behind. She's in the village. He misses her. There are a lot of poems in which he talks about missing her, but he's alone and she's alone. He's crossing the wilderness in order to find whatever he's looking for, you know. It's the landscape of very intense separation. And you know, a really interesting thing, according to the poeticians, the Tamil poeticians of the ancient period, this landscape, Palai, is called Nadu Tinai. That is to say, it's the landscape which is shared by all the landscapes. There is a dimension of separation, maybe even extreme separation, built even into the earliest moment of making love together before marriage. There is no landscape that lacks the dimension of separateness and separation, of longing and frustration. Sometimes in Palai, we find the young couple going through the wilderness together. So they might be together, but there still is separation because both of them have left behind that whole world of the village and their families, the parents, right? So they're alone. They're crossing the wilderness and it's a dangerous place. There are bandits and robbers and wild elephants and snakes. You'll see an example in a moment or two. And finally, we have Marudam, which is the language of the Delta. So here, believe it or not, Marudam, it's flat, rice fields, paddy fields. Here, the here the hero has come back and he's actually married the young woman. So you might think that that's the answer to their problem, but in fact it's not, because in a way Marudam is the most painful of all of the landscapes. That's the landscape of Wudal, quarrels. Because the husband is now the husband, this lover. This husband, he actually spends his nights with courtesans, with other women. And the typical scene in a Marudam poem is that the beloved, now the wife, she's standing at the door of the house at dawn, and she's waiting for her husband to come back from the house of one of these courtesans, and she's angry at him. They're quarreling. Quarreling isn't always such a bad thing. It's a part of the love relationship, but it's also not an easy thing. Okay? All of this clear so far? I'll just say one or two more words and then we'll move on to the next poem. The grammarians tell us that there are also two other tinas. You can see that the narrative, so to speak, the narrative of the love relationship is a kind of, how shall I call it? It's a kind of spiraling decline. It goes from those few happy moments of stolen love to this married union, which is the scene of quarreling, right? Okay. That's the Tamil vision of love. Now, there are these two extra tinas. One is called Kaikilai, one-sided love. There are not many poems of Kaikilai in the early Sangam anthologies. However, when the Tinai grammar is put to use in the Bhakti poems, beginning around the 6th century, then Kaikilai becomes a very dominant category, as you might imagine. Usually, it's the devotee in the voice of the woman, usually a feminine voice, and the devotee is complaining to the god that he never comes. The devotee feels love for him, the god or the goddess, usually it's the god, Shiva or Vishnu, but it's a one-sided love. There's a tremendous asymmetry. And then there's another category called Peruntinai, the big category. This is bad news. The big category, that is the love experience of most human beings in terms of the ancient Tamil grammar, is a love relationship which is simply unsuitable, not likely to succeed. The two lovers are not matched in any meaningful way. That's the big category. Again, there are not very many Peruntinai poems in the Sangam anthology, but later in the Bhakti corpus and after that, we do find them. And there's one of the Sangam anthologies, it's called Kalitohai, it's a later anthology where there are quite a few Peruntinai poems. We're not going to go into that today. Okay, yeah, let's read the next one. We'll have to go back to the previous page because it begins on the previous page, okay? So here's a poem. And I'm going to tell you in advance that this is a Nedal poem. So we're talking about the seashore, as you'll see in a second. And that means we're talking about Irangal, that is impatient waiting, very intense longing, okay? You see in bold, under the list of categories, there's the word, there are the two words, Ullurai Uvamam. Ullurai Uvamam, everybody see that? That's what we're going to be talking about today, because the central technique of the Sangam poems is this notion. I'm going to use the Tamil term for it throughout. Ullurai Uvamam, literally it means the simile, the comparison that lives inside. And you'll see what I mean by it in just a second. Okay, let's read the next poem. We'll just read the translation this time. Next, the third poem I'll read to you in Tamil also, okay? A little cormorant. Do you know what a cormorant is? It's a kind of a seagull-like bird, a bird who lives on the coast. A little cormorant with his red beak, looking for minnows, that is tiny fish, to feed the pregnant mate he loves, pecks in the black mud in deep holes filled with flowers. Let's go to the next page. On white sands, where village women have gathered vines to worship their god, stamping on thick pear-leaf creepers on the coast where he lives. He's cold to me. My love is ruined. My helpless misery is blossoming on all the tongues in this ancient village. My pain is much worse than pain. Okay, I think this poem also speaks for itself. And again, I think this is an experience that most of us know. My pain is much worse than pain. Sounds like a kind of modern poem, doesn't it? Has a modern feel to it. A lot of the Sangam poems feel as if they were written only very recently. I once read some of these poems in a class at the Hebrew University in Hebrew translation, and a student came up to me after, and she said to me, "You've been telling us that these are very old poems from the 1st and 2nd, 3rd centuries, but actually it's impossible. We think actually you must have composed them yourself, because they have a kind of modern feel, you know. My pain is much worse than pain. It's as if there was a kind of outer surface of pain and an inner surface of pain. And the inner surface is infinitely more jagged and powerful and disturbing than the outer surface. Even the word pain, noi in Tamil, even the word pain doesn't do justice to what she is feeling. She's feeling a kind of despair. Okay, now let's look at the beginning of this poem, because that's where the technique of Ulurai Uvamam comes. See, let's go back to the first page. Look at this, a little cormorant with his red beak, it's a male. He's looking for minnows to feed the pregnant mate he loves. See, the underlying assumption of the Tamil poets, and it's one that they shared, although there are hundreds of them, all of them shared this kind of notion, this technique, this Tamil grammar. It's a kind of miracle. We don't know how it happened, but they shared this same poetic world. And in that world, what you see outside and what you feel inside are intimately and intrinsically and necessarily linked. I'll try to explain why that should be the case in a moment, but first let's make sense of the poem. So there's this cormorant, this bird, and he's looking for food in order to bring back to his pregnant mate whom he loves. That's what the poet tells us. So what does that mean? The speaker, once again, the speaker, I can tell you it's a woman, it's the female voice. And she has inside of her, in her mind, a notion. She sees it in this external element of the bird. It's a notion of a loving mate, a partner, a lover who is there to feed his pregnant mate, right? But look at everything else she says. He, that is her lover, he's cold to me. He's cold to me. My pain is worse than pain. So there's a contrast between this image of the loving cormorant bird and the lover who is cold and distant and doesn't come anymore. That's Ulurai Uvamam. That means that something in the inner world corresponds to something that the speaker is perceiving or imagining. You know, perceiving and imagining in these poems, they're the same act. There is no perception which lacks an imaginative component. That's true throughout all of South Indian cultural history, in my opinion, but it's very pronounced in the Tamil poems. She's seeing something that she knows from inside. Not only that, perception is always selective. We don't see everything. We make a selection. How that selection happens, that's a big question. It has to do with the question of attentiveness, attention, which is one of the great human questions, if you ask me. But the idea here is that because of the tremendous resonance, emotional, affective resonance of the speaker, that is to say of the poet, which is to say of the reader or the listener, that resonance has to do with a certain selection. What is seen is something that is known from inside, and that is why it is seen, because she's paying attention to it. That's not all of the Ulurai Uvamam, because we have these village women. You see on the sands of the shore, there are these village women, and what are they doing? They're looking for vines, a certain kind of vine, in order to perform an act of puja to their god. And in so doing, they're stamping with their feet, trotting on these thick hair leaf creepers, that rumbu. It's a particular kind of creeper. They're stamping on these creepers. Guess what? That must be an image of the cold and absent lover. He's stamping on their love. That's what she says. She says, my love is ruined. She's miserable. Everybody's talking about it. By now you can't keep it secret. She's miserable. How do we know, though, that she feels that? I mean, she tells us eventually, but we know it even before she says it, because of the ulurai uvamam, because of this simile that exists inside, okay? That's the technique. That technique survived in Tamil poetry in different forms right up into the 20th century. Even today, you can sometimes find it, although today it's usually an unconscious thing. If we have time, we'll see some examples from the early modern period. One big example, okay? So far, so good. I hope you can see what it means. I want to say just a few words about why this notion of ulurai uvamam came into being, how it works, what the logic of it is. There are different ways we could explain it. One way to talk about it is to say that the inner and the outer worlds are not really that separate. They're very deeply connected. There's an organic, intrinsic relationship between them. The human being and the human world of feeling is organically connected to the external world of perception. That's one thing we could say about it. You could also say that what we have are a series of transitions or transpositions, that some image from outside somehow has made its way into the inner world, maybe via the eyes or the ears, like a seed. And it's growing there. And it may then eventually be re-externalized, projected outward again. Works in the other direction too. Something that the person is feeling can be projected outside. It'll grow outside and become some visible piece of the natural world. And it's a world, by the way, this is a world in which I don't think the word reflection does it justice. This is not that the outer world reflects the inner world or vice versa. It's not really a matter of reflection. It's more a matter of a kind of musical resonance, a tremendous internal resonance on all levels, inside and out. Okay? And what the poet does is he hears and he then finds words, and they're always concrete, tangible, visible images for that resonance. But he never exhausts it. That resonance, the amazing thing about these poems, we're reading them, we're reading them in the course of an hour and a half. But actually, if you read them over and over again, you'll see that that resonance never stops. It's a kind of buzz in the mind. It goes back and forth inside your mind as if you'd thrown a rock into a pool of water and the waves just go on back and forth. You cannot paraphrase one of these poems. You can say some things about it. I could say to you about the poem we just read, I could say, what this poem tells us is that the heroine is miserable. And she's miserable because her lover has kind of left her to her own devices and doesn't come anymore. But that doesn't do justice to the poem. The poem works because of all the parts of the poem that are not explicitly said. They're suggested partly by the ulurai uvamam and partly by the silences that are built into the poetic words. There's a lot of silence here. These poems, I said earlier, I'll say it again, they tend to be laconic, elliptical, understated. They're full of these resonant silences. You have to listen to those silences. It makes it really difficult for the translator, because the translator has to try to capture that dimension of these poems. Okay, let me stop for a moment and ask if there are questions about what I've said so far. Oh, I see there are some things from the chat. Good. There are notions from the chat. Okay.
Do we You see something in the chat?
I can see a few things on the chat.
But
And this is a moment, it's good to stop for a moment reading poems. It's not good to rush on. If you have any questions or thoughts about what I've just said, just let me know, either on the chat or by unmuting yourself for a second.
I mean, the things that I have to ask you, I think should wait till the end.
Okay, that's fair enough. But that's very tantalizing sentence.
No, not at all. I mean, it's okay. It's not tantalizing though.
You want to wait till the end though to ask it? We can wait.
I think we ought to.
This is in the category of impatient waiting.
Yes. No,
Okay. All right. Let's read I have one more Sangam period poem, and then we're going to shift into a medieval poem from the Chola period. But let's read one more. By now, none of you should have any difficulty understanding the next poem we want to read. We need the next page. Is it there? Just a second. Maybe we have it. Yeah. Okay, there it is. All right. Okay. This is again a poem for that Kurundahai anthology. And you can tell me when we finish reading the poem what Tinai, what landscape it belongs to, and who is speaking, and what's happening, what's it all about. This is a poem I like a lot. Did I not give you the time? Yes, I'll read it to you in the Tamil, okay? Nerunir ambal adai puratanna kodumen siraya kuruhir paravai ahalilai paravin saran munni pahalurai mudumaram pulamba pohum sirupun malai unmai hariven tori avar kana vunge. Yeah, one technical thing, by the way, you might notice that the penultimate line, the line before the last, is always short. It's short by one metrical unit. And that's a signal to the listener that the poem is about to end. Okay? Okay. So this is a poem about a bat. Well, that's the ulurai. Wings soft and bending like the outer sheath of the blue lily that grows deep in water. Sharp claws. All day long, the bat rests on the ancient jackfruit tree with its thick leaves on the mountain slope. Then it leaves the old tree behind to mourn and flies away as night falls. My friend, I know now what nightfall means, now that I can't see him. Okay, I think you by now have all the tools that you need to read this poem and understand it. And I don't want to say too many words about it. Actually, the Tamil does not have the word bat. It just says a bird, but the bat, it means the bat, Bauval. And the old commentaries tell us that. We know it's a bat. And this is a natural observation, some kind of naturalistic perception that the bat likes to live in the jackfruit tree. And it sleeps there upside down, as you know, all day long. And at night it takes off into the sky, right? Look what the poet says. The bat, incidentally, the bat has very soft wings. They're as soft as the water lily, but it also has sharp claws. By now, you should already know very well that this has got to be an image of the lover. This is a woman speaking again. Soft wings and sharp claws. And the lover, rather the bat, I guess, he's asleep all day long on the tree. And when night happens, malai, just like before evening, remember, same idea. When night happens, the bat flies away, leaving the old tree behind to mourn. I want you to notice that. It's very clear in the Tamil, and it's a beautiful thing. That tree, Mudumaram, this ancient tree, pulamba, the tree mourns. The tree has some kind of sentient awareness. The tree misses the bat. The tree is somebody. It's not an inert object. It's a living being, and it feels deserted, abandoned when the bat flies away at night. That's the principle of ulurai uvamam, this organic, intrinsic relationship between the outer and the inner. What is outside, it shares the feeling world of what is inside. And by now, you should easily be able to identify the tinai, and that's because we have that same word malai, evening, which we had in the previous mulai poem. So this is the mountain slope, but these are the sort of lower mountains, the hills of the pasture lands. And so the woman who is speaking, the Taivi, she's in that situation that we've already seen of patient waiting. Maybe not very patient, but it's patient waiting. Okay? She didn't even know what it meant for nightfall to happen until now that she's in love. Now she knows, because that's when the longing intensifies, the yearning. Okay? And the colophon actually tells us, the heroine speaks to her companion in her suffering. Her companion is her girlfriend. By the way, here's an interesting thing you should know. All Tamil aham poems from the old period, they have anonymous protagonists. The lovers have no names. It's the young woman, the young man, the friend of the man, the friend of the young woman, the foster mother of somebody, either the woman or the man. They have no personal names. They're archetypal figures, okay? That's different in the Puram corpus. In the Puram corpus, you have almost only identified heroes who have real names and who are connected to events in the outer world. That's the meaning of outerness there, The inner world, it's not a world of people who have names. Okay, I think that's going to have to be enough for the Sangam period. Now we're going to, because I was asked to speak about what happens to this poetic grammar over the centuries in Tamil. So now I'm going to show you. And we're going to read a few verses, thank you, from the Kamba Ramayanam, the Tamil Ramayana, which in my opinion, for what it's worth, is the most beautiful book ever composed in Tamil. It's my favorite Tamil book. It's endlessly fascinating. You can open it absolutely anywhere. There are 10,000 verses. Every verse you pick out, 10,000 Viruttam verses. Those of you who heard me yesterday know what a Viruttam verse is. 10,000 Viruttam verses. They're a kind of miracle, and every one of them is interesting. And they're also relatively simple to read. There are some poets that are very, very difficult to read. I could name a few. They're complex and they're untranslatable usually, but there are poets who are very simple to read, like Kalidasa in Sanskrit, like Dante in Italian, and like Kamban. It's a very readable book. The Tamilians have been using it for centuries for divination. In other words, if you have a problem and you don't know what to do, you're in some kind of dilemma, some life crisis, some existential problem, you don't know what to do, you can pick any volume of the Kamba Ramayanam, open the book at random, let your finger wander on the page and pick a verse, and the line of the verse that your finger lights upon will tell you what you're supposed to do. That's what they say. I've tried it. Actually, in a way, I think I could report that it does kind of work, Sometimes at least it works. Okay. Now, listen, let me just say a word or two about the Kamba Ramayanam. This is a work that belongs to the Chola period. We think that Kamban, we don't know for sure, but we think that Kamban lived in the 12th century. He came from a place called Tirarundur in the Kaveri Delta. And actually this whole Ramayanam is set in a way in the Kaveri Delta. That's the natural world of it. the rice fields, the paddy fields, the river, the Kaveri River. I mean, the river has a different name, and it's the story of the Ramayana, just as we all know it, with some interesting deviations or changes, but it's a Kaveri Delta text. And it's a text which was not composed for a royal court. That's rather important to know. Kamban is not a court poet. He's what we sometimes call a temple poet. And if you ever go to Tirunelveli, I've been there, you can see a kind of a sculpted portrait of Kamban on the Gopuram, on the inner side of the Gopuram, because they know that he was connected to the temple of Tirunelveli. And that's important because it tells you something about the audience of this poem. Kamban, by the way, was supposed to have been an uvachan, a drummer, a low caste drummer. And the tradition says that he improvised most of this text and very rapidly. And it happened in the following way. I'll tell you this story just to get you into the mood of reading Kamban. This is different from Sangam poetry. It gets you into the mood. So the thing is this, they say that there was a contest between two poets, Kamban, this low caste drummer, and a court poet called Ottakutan, a famous poet, Ottakutan. The idea was that they were going to, each of them, compose a Tamil Ramayana. And whoever finished first would be rewarded by the king. That's what the story tells us, you know, the Chola king. So Ottakutan, being a court poet, he set to work. And after a few months, he'd actually written, composed, I say written, let's say composed, up to some point in the Sundarakandam, actually the building of the bridge, the Setu, you know. He'd gotten quite far, but Kamban, who was a kind of bon vivant, a sort of playboy, he liked courtesans. He hadn't composed even a single verse, not even one. He was whiling away the time, you know, eating sambar and I don't know, meeting these courtesan ladies. But there came a moment where the king asked these two poets how far they had advanced in composing their respective Ramayanams. So Ottakutan said, well, I'm already at the building of the Setu Bridge from Rameshwaram to Sri Lanka. So Kamban said, oh, I've gone farther than that. Actually, they're already crossing the bridge. And he recited an improvised verse, a very beautiful verse on the spot, which had a very unusual word, Tamil word in it. I won't go into the details. Beautiful verse. Because nobody could understand this word that he had chosen, the Chola king and his entire entourage and the poet were sent off into the streets of Sri Rangam, where the big temple of Sri Rangam is, in the morning. And they were walking down the streets. The poet told them that they had to go there, and they heard suddenly one housewife, a Tamil housewife, used this word in conversation with another lady. That was the proof that Kamban's verse had a real authenticity about it, let's say. But then he had a problem, you see, because Ottakutan had advanced so far. The king said, well, in that case, you can both submit your Ramayana text in the next 2 weeks. So Kamban, this is what the tradition tells us. Kamban, he went to the great temple, Shiva temple at Tiruvotriyur, which is today a part of Chennai, northern part of Chennai, an old Chola temple. And he sat there composing verses day and night. At night, the goddess Bhagavati held a burning torch so that he could see. And he worked for 2 weeks and composed all the 10,000 magnificent, actually miraculous verses of the Kamba Ramayana in the course of those 2 weeks. That's what the tradition says. And then there's a very interesting story, which I don't have time to tell you, about the first public performance of this text at the Sri Rangam temple, the Arangetra. Maybe later, if there's time, we can come back to it. Okay, now what we're interested in is what has happened to the poetic grammar, and above all, the technique of Ulurai Uvamam, once we come into this medieval poem, 12th century poem, where there's a lot of landscape description. But as we'll see in a moment, the grammar of these Tinai landscapes has been somehow put aside, and instead we find something a little different. That's what I want you to see. So here are a few verses. We'll only read maybe 3 or 4 verses from a very beautiful section of the Gandhigram, the Chitrakuta Pagalam. You know that when Rama, Lakshmana, and Sita go off into the wilderness, so first there is a moment when the boatman Guha takes them across the river, right? I assume you all know. And then they begin walking towards this mountain, which is called Chitrakuta mountain, where they're going to spend some years. It's thick wilderness. This is very, very early on in the exile from Ayodhya, maybe the 2nd or 3rd day. And, you know, they're walking, of course, they're walking maybe barefoot, and they're walking in this wilderness. And for Sita, this is a very new experience. Sita, like any Chola princess, she almost never left the palace, the royal palace that she grew up in, Sita. She's what's called in Sanskrit, Asuryam Pasha. She never even saw the sunlight outside because she was always indoors. A Chola princess was guarded inside the palace, you know. So this is very new to her. She's now walking a long distance into a wilderness, Kade, with her husband and with her brother-in-law, Lakshmana. And everything she sees is new and maybe interesting, but also maybe a little spooky or scary. And Rama speaks to her. Now, I have to tell you, Rama in the Ramayana, there's no question that he is the god Vishnu. In the Valmiki Ramayana, it's an open question because Rama, he may be Vishnu, but he doesn't know it. He's forgotten his identity. That may also be true in Kamban. I can't go into this problem now. It's a really interesting problem. It's quite important. One thing I can say is that in the Ramayana, Rama doesn't usually speak. He's mostly silent. Remember, I was talking about the silences in the Sangam poems. In the Ramayana, it's quite unusual to hear Rama actually say anything at all. He's God, he's Lord Vishnu, but he usually doesn't speak. But he feels things in a very intense way. There's no doubt about that. And as they're walking into this Chitrakuta place in the wilderness, we have a series of beautiful verses in which he points out various things in the landscape to Sita. Almost like a Sangam poet writing a poem in which the landscape has all kinds of interesting and suggestive things, right? So let's read a few of these poems and you'll see what I mean. And maybe you'll have some idea of why this poetic technique has developed in the way it does and what the poet is trying to do with it. Probably the moment that we are in is right before dawn, or maybe dawn itself. It's not entirely clear. They're walking. It seems like this is the moment just before dawn. Okay, so it's kind of dark, and the darkness is getting a little lighter by the moment. So let me read the verse. I'll recite it in Tamil. Then actually, we have a few to read. Let's start with the first one. Kurudi valdena sevvari paranda katkuile maruvi malvarai umbaril kurikindra varudai surudi por teli marakada korun sudar sutra parudi vanavan pasumbari niharpana parai. That's a Viruttam verse, classic Viruttam style. Your eyes. He's talking to Sita. This is Rama speaking to Sita. Most of these verses in this Chitrakuta Paralam, most of them, not all of them, but most of them they have two parts to them. There's an address to Sita. He describes her in some way, in a way that's usually meant to be complimentary, but let's see what you make of it. There's the address to Sita, and then there's the content of what he wants her to see, to look at, to pay attention to, okay? So far, so good. Everybody with me still? I hope you're with me.
Yes.
Okay, thanks for that. He says, your eyes, sweet cuckoo, are streaked with red like a sword stained with blood. I don't know if you think this is a great compliment to a beloved wife. It's a very conventional thing to say in Tamil. The eyes of a beautiful woman, and all women by definition are beautiful, The eyes of a beautiful woman, they shouldn't have these little red streaks in them, you know? Sivari. That's what the verse says, Sivari. That's considered a mark of beauty. And it's usually compared to something like spears or swords or some other violent weapon. And that's because the look of a beautiful woman actually is very, very dangerous. Dangerous for the lover, for the person that she looks at, because he's likely to fall in love with her. And then look what happens. Remember the Tamil love scenario. He's going to spend the rest of his life longing for her and being separated from her in one way or another. It's also true of the Ramayana, if you think about it. So a woman's eyes are dangerous. So he says very nonchalantly in a way, your eyes are streaked with red, like a sword stained with blood. Look at the mountain goats skipping near the peak with its emerald sheen, lucent as truth. Or maybe they're the green horses of the sun circling the sky. There's this mountain, they're on this mountain. So what landscape are we in, do you think? We must be in Kalavid, stolen love. Must be. But the standard markers, what are called Porul in Tamil, they're not here so much. We'll see in a moment. Instead, there's something else, but they're in a mountain landscape. And that mountain is made of something like emerald. It's an emerald mountain, so it's green, and it's early morning, so there's a kind of green glow. And there are mountain goats up there. They're jumping around near the top of the mountain. And the mountain is lucent as truth, as luminous and clear, and maybe as beautiful and stark, perhaps, as truth. That's what he says. And then he says, well, maybe they're these goats. Actually, maybe they're the sun, the horses, the green horses of the sun. I don't know if you know that Surya, the sun, he has these horses and they're supposed to be green. They're circling the sky because it's dawn, right? So he's on, that's why, as I just said, you must be dawn or perhaps dawn. So I don't have a lot to say about this verse. Maybe one of you does, but I can say that there is a figure here, a poetic figure. I think I said to you yesterday, those of you who heard me yesterday know that during the Chola period, maybe even before it, the kind of figuration that is normative in Sanskrit poetics made its way into Tamil. It was formalized in this famous book of Dandin, the Kavya Dausha, the Mirror of Poetry. We talked about it a little bit yesterday. I don't want to say too much about it here. But that kind of figuration comes into Tamil already, actually, we could say in the Tevaram poets of the 7th or 8th or 9th century, definitely in Kamban, definitely in the Jain text I was talking about yesterday. We have one of those figures here. It's a figure called Sandeha, doubt. See what Rama says? He can't make up his mind what he's looking at, what he's pointing out to Sita, these mountain goats. But maybe they're the horses of the sun. Doubt, Sandeha, it's a relatively simple figure, but you can see that it's based on a kind of comparison, a simile, right? Upama, it's a kind of simile. Otherwise, there would be no doubt. If he can't make up his mind what they are, goats or horses, it must be that there's something that is shared, a shared attribute between them, right? He doesn't know. And although that's a relatively simple kind of figure, I just want to say in passing that in fact, doubt is a really, really interesting part of the mind. And if we were to read the Advaita poets from the South, and the theorists of Advaita from the Tamil country, from the late early modern period, you could see that they believe that doubt is the primary vritti, that is the primary mental mode of the manas, of the mind. That's what the mind is for. It's constantly filled with doubt, including, by the way, self-doubt. They think it's the fundamental experience of anybody who has a mind, self-doubt. You can check this against your own minds and see if you feel it's true or not. So this figure of doubt, it's not just a kind of mechanical thing. It has some interest for us because it seems to tell us something about what's going on in Rama's mind. There's an element of doubt. And he's got this projected, you could say, onto the landscape. Okay, let's read the next poem. The next one is a little more, you know what, I'm going to read two poems. No, we'll read one. We'll read the next one. We'll take them one by one. So this one's a little more dense. Vardan kol pun mulai mada maile marai madama ardange per vayitara vuri maidorum toraki tarangalorum nindraduva dandalai ayotti nurange malikai tuhit kodini harpana nokai. You know, if we had time, I'm sorry we don't have more time. If we had time, I'd read it to you in the Viruttam style, which is to repeat whole phrases of it, sometimes several times so that they sink into the mind, you know. We don't have time for that, but you should imagine it. It's a little bit like in Carnatic music, where actually a singer who's performing a Carnatic kriti will do that. Maybe many times. He'll pick a phrase out of the kriti and repeat it 10, 15, 20 times. And every time he repeats it, it means something a little different. Look, Nokai, it's the final word of the poem. Look, he's constantly telling her, pay attention. Look at what I'm seeing. I want you to see what I'm seeing. Look, caught in every clump of bamboo, at every turn of the trail, are sloughs of serpents. Slough, you know, is what the serpent, when the serpent molts, right? The skin, the dead skin of the serpent is left behind. That's called a slough in English. At every turn of the trail are sloughs of serpents whose gaping mouths can overpower elephants black as rain. They're dancing in the wind, the sloughs are. They're dancing in the wind like the sheer flags flying over tall palaces in Ayodhya, city of garlands. Can you see them, my love, with pearls dancing on your breasts? Okay, these have got to be pythons, the snakes, right? They can swallow an elephant. And if we follow the image, well, I don't know, ask yourself, suppose you were walking in the wilderness for the first time in your life with your spouse, and it's dawn, and your spouse says something to you like, gosh, there must be a zillion pythons here because there are all these sloths, and these pythons, they can swallow big elephants. Elephants black as rain. They're dancing in the wind. I mean, would that make you feel a kind of zoological curiosity? Would it make you feel like you aren't too sure you really wanted to continue along this path? You're walking barefoot on the ground. You might step on one of these pythons. They also jump out of trees, by the way. That's a true fact. I mean, that's a known fact. It's not only poets, you know, they jump out of the trees. So anyway, I think there's something a little spooky about what Rama is telling Sita. And why is he doing that? Why does he say this? Why has the poet done this? So, you know, yeah, you tell me, please. Yeah.
I don't know, maybe he's trying to warn her of the dangers that might come, like kind of a foregrounding about what is going to happen.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. Thank you, Asit. That's absolutely right. There's no doubt about it. And what you're saying, you'll see it also in the coming verses.
Also,
sorry, go ahead.
Is this image of elephants black as rain, is it one of the figurations that come from the Kavya Darsa? Because I think something similar is there in Kalidas also.
Sanskrit elephants are also often very dark. We tend to think of elephants as being kind of gray, I suppose, you know, but actually in Sanskrit poetry, all of Indian poetry, they very often are dark. They're also dark because of the must that comes off of their, you know, cheek lobes. but it's a common thing. And yes, you could say that's a kind of Dandin style figuration. It's not only a matter of foreshadowing. There's more to it than that. There's also, we could call retro shadowing, because the next thing he says, that these sloughs of the snakes, they're just like the flags, these banners that are flying from the top of the palaces in Ayodhya. Why does he say that? I mean, one possibility is that he's kind of trying to domesticate this wilderness for Sita. He said, well, actually, it's just like at home. There are all these snake skins wherever he says at every turn of the trail. But actually, it's a lot like being at home in the palace. Don't you remember those flags that are flying from the upper stories of the palaces? You know, it's a way of domesticating it. But actually, if you think about it, and you look at the whole image, then it seems as if he were referring also to the darker side of Ayodhya. Because please remember that these three people, Rama, Lakshmana, and Sita, they are all three of them post-traumatic. They've just been through a catastrophe in Ayodhya. Rama was about to become king. They've been exiled into the wilderness for 14 years. So there's the disaster that is about to come, as Asit said. Ravana, the Rakshasas, the whole war, right? That's there. The poet is telling us about it. How is he telling us about it? By Ulurayuvamam, by some external feature of the landscape, which must reflect some internal feeling or knowledge or perception. I'll say more about that in a second. But it also has memory in it, because in the minds of all of these three characters, there must be that darker side of Ayodhya. It's not so clear that they'd even want to go back there. Right? Well, there are another few things I could say about this, but maybe let's leave it at that for now. We've seen Sita with her eyes that are like a blood-stained sword. And now we've seen these snakes and the elephants. Let's read another verse. Salam telekonda sietal, tani madakada ma, ulanda virdalil, sindina udirattin madavar, pulanda kala itrukana, kunguma podil kalanda muttena vera muttimaipana kanai. He's talking to Sita, and he says to her, pearls, you'll remember, are born from elephants' tusks. I don't know if all of you know this. This is a natural fact in poetry. You know that there are 12 different ionis, different birthplaces of pearls. We tend to think that pearls come from the mother of pearl shell, right, in the ocean. That's the standard theory. But in Indian poetry, not only in Tamil, also in Sanskrit, actually the whole of the pre-modern Indian poetry, pearls come from all kinds of places. The bamboo, for example, you know, the knots in the bamboo stem, pearls are supposed to spontaneously grow there. And also from an elephant's forehead, those lobes in the forehead I was talking about earlier, where the musk comes, pearls are born there. And also from the tusks, as you can see here, the tusks are a site, one of the yonis of pearls in Indian poetry, okay? And so he says, you'll remember, because she's supposed to know this. Everybody who's ever read a Tamil poem should know where pearls come from. Pearls, you'll remember, are born from elephants' tusks. And when you see them shining in blood from the body of a lonely, mad elephant slain by a raging lion, you can't help but think of scattered pearls still coated with kumkum and sandal paste that women who have fought with their lovers have torn from their breasts. Well, I don't know whether you can't help but think of that. But Sita, this is a Tamil Sita. She's spent a lot of her youth in the palace listening to Tamil poetry. By the way, Rama speaks Tamil in the Gandhigram. That's his first language. He also knows Sanskrit, but he's a Tamil speaker. No question about it. The poet tells us he speaks Tamil. He's a master of Tenmuri, the southern language. So we can assume that Sita knows what Tamil poetry is like. Okay. And the first association, Rama says to her, you look, you know, you can see these pearls. What are the pearls doing there? They're soaked in blood. Why is that? Because they are born from the elephant's tusks, as we just said. But this elephant has been killed. It's a lonely, mad elephant. That also matters. It's been killed by a lion. Lions kill elephants, you know. So when you look at these pearls, you see them soaked with blood. It brings to mind something. What does it bring to mind? If you know Tamil poetry, it brings to mind the landscape of Wudal, the Marudam landscape, which is a landscape of quarrels, remember? And when they quarrel, the two lovers, again, I want to say it's not necessarily a bad thing to quarrel, but still, when they quarrel, one of the first things that happen is that the woman, the Talaivi, she tears off her necklace of pearls, and the pearls are scattered all over the place, and they're red because they're coated with the kumkum and sandal paste that she had on her breasts. Okay, so it may not be true for all of us, but for Sita, this is supposedly a very natural association. But what is he telling us, actually, the poet, or Rama to Sita? What is he telling us? Here's another incredibly violent image. So not only are there pythons at every turn, there are also apparently lions. I don't know if any of you have gone to the lion reserves that you have also in the Tamil country and all over South India, all over India, actually. You know, it's not such a simple thing to see a wild lion. It's a bit scary. And so once again, we have some sense of a suggestion of what is going to come. And that suggestion seems to be augmented or intensified by the poetic convention of the Wudal quarrel of the two lovers, right? And once again, I want to say that the underlying suggestive register of these poems, among other things, is to the entire Ramayana story, including its silences. Now, I don't want you to think that these verses are all of them filled with violence. We're going to read two more verses. Since time is almost over. So let me read these verses just in English, right? Isn't that right? When we have another 15, 20 minutes. We'll read these verses because it'll allow us to make a kind of summing up. And then maybe there'll be time for a few questions. And my gentle cuckoo, far more charming than dancing peacocks. You know how beautifully these Kinnara couples can sing. Do you know the Kinnaras? They're in a mountain landscape. Kinnaras are these half human, half horse people. They're Gandharvas, they're musicians. They're the musicians of the gods, and they live high in the mountains. And they sing and play music beautifully. So he says, you know how beautifully these Kinnara couples can sing. They can melt the hearts of mountain girls who are so mad at their lovers that they won't sleep with them, but who begin to feel sorry when they hear that music. You bring a sweetness to my mind whenever I think of you, my love. Listen, the mountain girls are sitting on swings hung from tiger trees and silk cotton, heavy with honey, and they're singing songs in the mountain mode, Kurinji, that's a musical mode, a raga mode, while the Asunam beast who loves music has crept up to listen. Okay, so here's another piece of zoological information. I don't know if any of you have ever met the Asunam. In Tamil poetry, we don't even know where the word comes from, but in Tamil poetry, there's a notion that there's this mythological animal, a mythic animal called the Asunam. And he loves music. He's a connoisseur of music. I suppose Carnatic music. But the thing is that if he hears, he's very sensitive, hypersensitive. And if he hears a false note, some note sung out of tune, it is so painful to him that he dies on the spot. they say about Mozart, the Western composer Mozart, that he was like that if he heard a dissonant note, he would faint, he would pass out. So the Asunam is like that, but only worse. He hears a dissonant note, he dies. But he's creeping up to listen to the music that these mountain girls, these are human girls, are singing, but they're also the Kinnara couples who are there. They're also singing beautifully, right? And what about those couples? They're also quarreling with their lovers, it seems. The women are mad at the lovers, usually because of some minor indiscretion or a minor mistake or lack of sensitivity or something like that. So they won't sleep with them anymore. But the music changes their hearts and they begin to feel sorry. Music can do that. Whose music is it, you know? It has to be, this is the music of the poet Kamban talking about his own poetry. Because throughout the Kamba Ramayana, we have these verses where Kamban is saying something about the immense musicality of his own verses. It's true also for the Asunam beast. We're like that Asunam. If there's a discordant note, who knows what will happen to us? We have to listen to that music. If I had to say, because we're short on time, let me just say that we have a technique which is in some ways continuous, very continuous with the old Ullurai Uvamam, in the sense that what you see outside, what you pay attention to outside, that perceptual imaginative act, it must resonate with all kinds of things that are happening inside, and particularly inside. When I say inside, I mean in the mind. So the traditional poetic grammar that we began with its grammaticalized markers of specific moments and feelings, that very ramified grammar has been partly set aside. But the basic mechanism, the primary technique, is still very much in place. So what is the Ullurai Uvamam here? What is the register of suggestion? Well, one thing we've already said, and that is that it seems to refer to the entirety of the Ramayana story, which we can be sure that every listener or reader of Kamban knew. And that's a very harsh story, filled with agony. It has other things, but there's a lot of agony. Just think about it. Think of what happens at the end. When Rama has actually killed Ravana, got Sita back, and he rejects her out of hand. Won't even talk to her. And think of everything that they have to go to reach that point. That agony, that darker side of the world, is part of what these verses are telling us. It exists within the memory and the mind of the listener. Then there's the self-reference of the poet who says something like, well, I'm paraphrasing it, it's not a good idea, but he says something like, look at what I'm telling you. It's very beautiful. It's a beautiful music. You have to open your ears and open your hearts and listen to that music. It's a beautiful thing, but there's a dark side to it. And that's the side that has, how shall I say it, has a dimension of almost unspeakable loneliness, just like we saw in the early Tamil poems. And then there are two other things, because as I said just a moment ago, Kamban is interested in the way the mind works. And especially, I'll just toss this out, and we don't have time to go into it. He's especially interested in the unconscious parts of the mind, the parts that are half conscious or entirely unconscious, but that come into a kind of awareness in relation to the outer setting. You could say that the Kamba Ramayana offers us a kind of model of the mind. That's different than the Sangam poems. This is a model that applies to the nature of the characters that belong in this story. For example, Rama himself. I remember I said to you, he hardly ever speaks, but he thinks and he feels. If you want to know how his mind works, that is the mind of God, then these verses will show you an element of it, some elements of it. And the last thing that is that because these are, after all, a kind of bhakti poem, long bhakti poem, it also seems to be how shall I say, evoking, suggesting something in the relationship of the devotee, the bhakta, to the God, who is on the whole rather inscrutable. There's an asymmetry built into the relation. And he's telling us things, but he tells us in very indirect ways. And the bhakta has his own love relationship, which is like all love relationships in these Tamil poems, rather fraught. It's not only a matter of a kind of tragic loss and sadness and loneliness, there's a lot of that, but it's fraught and complicated. And in the case of the bhakti relationship, definitely asymmetrical. And that's what the bhakti feels, what the bhakta poet feels. Okay, I think we've kind of exhausted the time. So we take a few minutes to see it, and I'm still waiting to hear Ipshita's question. And I hope that you have at least some idea of how this poetic technique, so old and classical, has evolved into the medieval period in Tamil. I was hoping to show you a somewhat later example too. That'll have to be some other time.
I think if it's all right with you, if you have time, I mean, we can.
I have plenty of time.
Oh, sure.
Plenty of time.
Well, so do we.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Zoom is not going to evict us.
No, Zoom shall not evict us. I mean, that was the whole point. I mean, we will tell you the story of why Zoom will not evict us later on, but now this is more important.
That's good. Now, I'm happy to go on if you like to.
Please do. Please do.
Okay. But maybe, Ipshita, you should ask your question now, and then I'll read the next. Let's have a little more time. Yeah.
Yeah, just to provide comic relief. It's extremely trivial. But, I mean, the primary thing which I'll ask you now is regarding, you know, the musicality of it. I think all of it taken together. Because in the Sangam verses, because of lack of access to the language, I think that's not enough. I think it's something else which you will help us with. How does one understand how these verses are recited?
So, that's a very important question, and it has implications for the entire history of modern Tamil erudition and the nature of the tradition. I'll just put it very simply. This is a longish story, but we have lost, the Tamil tradition has lost the modes of recitation that were current until as late as the late 19th century. We've lost them. I could explain to you how I know for sure that that's the case, but it's a long story. There are some recordings, very few. There was a Devadasi called the Shamuga Vadivelu. There are 2 or 3 recordings. These Devadasis were the carriers of the tradition. They recited and sang the poems. So if you listen to them, you get some idea of what it was once like. And we have written testimony from the mid-19th century, for example, by Uwe Saminath Iyer, the great scholar, who tells how he used to recite a poem, a Tamil poem. But we don't really quite know. I mentioned this in Tamil because that is not the case in Telugu, for example, or in Malayalam. In Telugu and Malayalam, the tradition is far more continuous than the Tamil case. And that has to do with historical questions we really can't go into here. Partly it has to do with the fact that Madras was a great kind of colonial center. And as a result, there was a break in the tradition. And I think it would not be an exaggeration to say that the last 1,000 years or so of Tamil poetry has become more or less inaccessible, unreadable to Tamil readers today, even people who know and like Tamil poetry well. They don't know how to read it. They've lost the protocols of reading. These protocols have to be reconstructed, and they don't really know how to sing the verses. So if I recite a verse, what you're hearing, this is not Telugu. If it was Telugu, there'd be no problem. Or Sanskrit, I could recite it, in the way that, there are many different ways of doing it, but each meter has its own raga form and so on. It's not a problem, and the tradition is continuous. In Tamil, in a way, those of us who still recite Tamil poetry, we do it in a form that has been kind of reinvented on the basis of the little bits and scraps of knowledge that we have of these older recitation modes. You know? It's a problem. Actually, it's a sad thing. It's a really sad thing. We've lost that knowledge, you know. Okay, if we have time, do you want to say something more, Shida? No, all right.
Yes, but no. We'll listen to you first.
Okay, so listen, we'll read this poem. Listen, I have to give you a little background here. Okay, this is an experiment. I am not at all sure you're going to like this poem. I was pretty sure that the Sangam poems would be accessible to everybody. And I also thought that the Kamba Ramayana poems would also speak to you because they're so lovely and they're relatively easy to read. I have to say, let me say please that we have only begun to scrape the surface of the complexity of those poems. If we were to spend an hour or two with each one of the verses that we read, we'd go a lot more deeply into them, you know. But I'm going to read a poem with you. It's an experiment. We'll see if you find it interesting or beautiful or not. And I think you'll understand why I'm bringing this poem, because there's a certain kind of complexity that has to do with the different kinds of poetic systems that are at work in this poem. I'm looking at this poem under 6. We're going to leave 5 alone. 6 will take us a little while. If you like, we can come back to 5 later. Okay, we're looking at 6. This is a poem by a poet called Tirukurugai Perumal Kavirayar. He belongs to the first half of the 16th century. So we've skipped about, I don't know, 300 or 400 years since Kamban, right? And I couldn't make out what was being said. Was that Redmi? Okay, anyway.
Somebody's mic is on, which
Yeah, I see. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me say a few words about this poet. Again, we've gone about, I don't know, 3 or 4 centuries beyond Kamban. Tamil poetry developed over these centuries. And one of the ways it developed was that it fully internalized in a very conscious way that other kind of poetic system that I was talking about earlier, the figurative analysis that we associate with Dandin and the followers of Dandin. It internalized the system. This poet, Tirukurugai Perumal Kavirayar, I'm going to call him Kavirayar, he wrote 2 grammars of poetry in Tamil. And there's something new, both of them. One is a grammar of figuration. It's called Madan Alankaram. And the second one is a grammar of Aham poetry, like in the Sangam world. Aham love poetry, but in a new kind of embodiment, you know, a new formulation. So he wrote a grammar of both of these kinds of poetic systems, the old Sangam love poetry and the figuration that was inherited from Dandin. And he invented himself, composed poems to illustrate the different kinds of figurative operations that exist in both cases, okay? He lived in a place that is today called Arvar Tirunagari. It's in the very far south of the Tamil country, the Pandya country, and it's called Arvar Tirunagari because that's where the great Arvar poet Nammarvar was born. And, you know, if we had time, it would be nice to talk a little bit about Nammarvar, because he was a very great poet. And some of you may know that a translation of the whole of his Tiruvaimori just came out in Penguin Books. It's translated, beautifully translated by Archana Venkateshan. And also some of these poems are available on YouTube. All you have to do is type in Tiruvaimori, Archana Venkateshan, and Sikil Gurucharan, who's a very well-known Carnatic singer, and he's singing in the Viruttam style some of these Nammarvar verses. It's absolutely wonderful. So you have access to the Tiruvayamuri now in a really good translation. This poet, Kavirayar, he was born in that same town, which was then called Kurugai or Tirukurugur or Tirukaruvur, but today it's called Arva Tirunagari. He was a devotee of the god of that temple, that is Lord Vishnu, and also of the poet Namarvar, who has another name. He's also known as Maran. That's why he called his grammars Maran Alankaram and Maran Ahaporul, right? Because his poetry is all about Namarvar and the god, the Lord Vishnu, particularly at that temple, but also at Sri Rangam, as in the verse that we're going to recite, okay? I guess that's enough background information. Now, listen, I'm telling you in advance, this is a complicated book. It could be that we'll have to read it twice, and then I'm going to take it apart for you. But we'll see if you have something to say about it, okay? It's an aham poem. This is an aham poem. Okay, I'll read it to you. A monkey snatches a sweet green mango from the tree whose branches fill the sky and enjoys it. But when the guardians of the cool grove come close, sadly he scampers off to another branch and lingers there unsatisfied. Like flawless cow's milk porridge that heals all ills, boiled and poured into golden vessels, wasted on menial people who want only sour rice gruel, kanji. The sweet pulp of the ripening jackfruit, heavy and golden among the jack tree's twisted roots, goes to seed and is wasted in your well-watered village. It's like when people dying to drink up the whole ocean of milk created by a Rangan, Lord of Sri Rangam himself, Ranganatha. Sri Rangam, the Lord of Sri Rangam, who is praised to the best of their ability by scholars of subtle understanding who have drunk up the ocean of books. It's like when such people, dying to drink up the whole ocean of milk, are served a taste of milk, sweet as ambrosia, in a squat, flat bowl, not even full. Coming here and begging for love that's full of pain for the sake of a little pleasure just won't work. All you have to do is say goodbye. We need the next page. Can you go on to the next page? All you have to do is say goodbye. Is it there? Yes, to those whores. It's too bad we had a page break. But I'm going to read the poem again in a second.
Oh, I'm sorry, I think that was dramatic. And
yeah, it was dramatic. That's true. Okay.
Yeah, please.
Listen, I'm not claiming that this poem is transparent and that all you have to do is hear it and you'll understand what it's about. I wouldn't say that. Okay, listen to this. I have a way to help you understand this poem. Then we're going to read it again. And we'll take apart the figures. So Kavirayar, he had a shishya, a student, whose name was Kari Ratnam, and they called him Kari. And Kari Ratnam, still 16th century figure, of course, direct student of the poet, he wrote a commentary on the grammars that Kavirayar wrote. And he's very helpful, Kari, because he tells you what he thinks the poem means. Okay, so this is a aham poem, and here's what Kari says. This is Kari speaking, not me. He says the speaker in the poem is the hero's long-term mistress. Okay, this is something you really need to know. In the Sangam world too, I told you that the Maradam landscape is a landscape of quarrels, and that the husband spends his nights with these courtesans, you know? So these courtesans, sometimes we're talking about very casual relationships, transient and casual relationships, but there's also a notion of a long-term mistress, a very stable, even loving relationship between the husband of this Talaivi that we know from the Sangam corpus and one particular courtesan. And you know, that actually is very much like the reality in the villages throughout South India. Devadasis, for example, usually they had very stable relationships with a single patron. It's like a kind of marriage. However, there is this distinction between the long-term mistress and all the other courtesans who are kind of, you know, they come and go. Okay, so Kari says, the speaker is the hero's long-term mistress. What she says indirectly is, you don't go to your noble lover's home, that means her, in the evening, but instead you play with the young courtesan from that part of the village, that other part of the village. And since she's a common woman, other men also hang around her house. So, left to your own devices, you leave, though you still keep circling her home. He leaves because there are other men there too, lovers. I was expecting you to come. She's the long-term mistress, right? I was expecting you to come, so I adorned myself, made myself beautiful, but you were late. To assuage my sorrow at this waste of my beauty, you come here and stand at the gate and beg me. For the sake of a little pleasure, I have to suffer much grief in loving you. Your duty is to take leave of that courtesan's home. Okay, I don't know whether you would have guessed that that is what this poem is about without Kari's help. But it kind of makes sense. I don't think it exhausts the poem. I said to you earlier, paraphrasing a Tamil love poem is a bad idea. Never exhausts the meaning of it. But Kari has told us something interesting. So let's go back and read the poem again, okay? Let's see how Kari came to this conclusion. Okay, so we'll read the first part of the poem. I'm going to stop after the first Ulurai Uvamam. A monkey snatches a sweet green mango from the tree whose branches fill the sky and enjoys it. But when the guardians of the cool grove come close, sadly he scampers off to another branch and lingers there unsatisfied. That is an Ulurai Uvamam. And you can understand it because we read a few poems in which we have this technique. We have a monkey. So the monkey technically belongs to the mountain landscape. Kalav is stolen love. Here, actually, it looks like the poem as a whole belongs to Marudam because of the courtesan aspect, you know. But there seems to be an element of that stolen love. And the Sangam grammar, the old poetic grammar, allows that. There's what's called tinai mayakam, the mixing of tinais. A good poet, he can bring a karu, that is to say an element from one landscape, and mix it into elements from another landscape. And that allows him to create a very subtle, complex kind of emotional situation inside the speaker and the listener or the reader too, right? Now, what about that monkey? He actually enjoys the mango. So far, so good. That's Kalavi. He steals it, right? Kalavi, stolen love. But the guardians of the grove come and they chase him away, I guess. So he scampers off to another branch and lingers there unsatisfied. Remember, according to Kari, the lover, the Talaivan, who is the addressee of this poem, he didn't come to his longtime mistress. He's hanging out in this house where this young courtesan lives, and there are a lot of other lovers who are waiting their turn to be with her. That's like the monkey. And he's unsatisfied. That's the first indication that we have in this interesting poem. I think it's an interesting poem, that there's a kind of element of dissatisfaction and frustration built into the whole utterance. That's an Ulurai Uvamam, number one. We have three, I'm telling you in advance, there are three Ulurai Uvamams in this poem. Okay, let's go on. Like flawless cow's milk porridge that heals all ills, boiled and poured into golden vessels, wasted on menial people who want only sour rice gruel, like that, something, something, something. We'll come to it, the jackfruit. Let's stop here though, because you see that word like? That word in itself means that we're in the old Dandin style, Sanskrit style figurative mode. Like, it's an upama. Something is like something else. He's not suggesting it to the Ulurai Uvamam. He gives us an explicit statement of a simile. Number one, there's going to be another one like that. That means already in this poem, we have a mixture of two poetic systems. Why should the poet want to do that? I'll say something about it in a moment. What is what is that upama? Well, it's like milk. Let's say that there's some very, some very wealthy person who he's boiled milk. He's had his servants make a cup of, a pot of milk, serves it in a golden cup, but it's served to people who don't want it. All they want is kanji, this sour gruel. That's all they know, and that's all they want. The milk in its golden cup is wasted on them. And so here, in this simile, we have, for the first time in this poem, we have a theme of something being wasted, something precious and wonderful and delicious being wasted. Okay, I'm going to go on. Like that, like this milk, which is spoiled, wasted on these people who don't know how to drink it. Like that, the sweet pulp of the ripening jackfruit, heavy and golden, among the jack tree's twisted roots, goes to seed and is wasted in your well-watered village. What's this? This is the second Ulurai Uvamam. And what's the image? You can actually see an image of this on YouTube if you like. All you have to do is type, not on YouTube, sorry, on the internet, type in jackfruit or jack tree. And you can see how the jackfruit root, if it's lying at the roots of the tree, jackfruit usually have to climb up the tree to cut it down, right? But there's jackfruit that lies at the roots of the tree. And if you don't cut it off soon enough, it's ruined. It's completely wasted. And the roots are twisted. It's heavy and golden and something very edible and delicious and nourishing too, by the way. But if you let the jackfruit on the ground at the roots of the tree go to waste, then you've wasted something very important. And that's what he says, it's wasted in your well-watered village. Somebody, guess who, is wasting the love of the speaker. So we've seen disappointment, and we've seen this notion of a kind of foolish waste, a waste of something precious. You know what? That's a theme that doesn't exist in Sangam poetry. We've come to a new idea. There's all kinds of other themes, but the idea of wasting love, I don't think is really there. It's a modern idea. You know what? In my world, the early 16th century is the beginning of the modern period, the beginning of modernism in South India, before the colonial people came and did what they did, before that. Okay, let's read on. We've had one Ulurai Uvamam, one Alankara, Upama, and a second Ulurai Uvamam. I hope you're still following me. Now, it's like, okay, that means we're in the second Upama, the Dandin style Alankara. It's like when people dying to drink up the whole ocean of milk created by Arangan, the Lord of Sri Rangam himself, who is praised to the best of their ability by scholars of subtle understanding who have drunk up the ocean of books. Guess who that is? That's got to be the poet speaking about himself, Kavirayar. He's that poet. He's drunk up all the Tamil books. Believe me, he knew everything in Tamil, including the old Sangam poems, which were still current in the 16th century. So it's like those kind of people, they want to drink up the whole ocean of milk, which the God has created. But they're served a taste of milk sweet as ambrosia in a squat, flat bowl. That's a particular kind, like a plate, not even full. Not even full. So there's that theme that we had at the beginning of not being satisfied. Remember? The monkey. And it's come back at us again. It's not enough. They want to drink the whole ocean of milk, and all they get is a flat plate of milk with a few sips. That's all they get. So it's a complaint. The speaker, she's talking, of course, about her lover. Same idea. It's a waste. It's a big waste. Everything is a big waste, you know. She wants the whole ocean of milk. What she gets is a few isolated drops of it. So she's complaining to her lover. But the poet is also complaining to his God. And then it makes you wonder if the person, let's call it the person who is responsible for the greatest amount of waste, is not the God himself. He's wasting the love that the poet and the bhakta devotee want to give him. He can't reciprocate. There's that asymmetry that we had before. And now we have a final Ulurai moment where she says, making clear her intention, coming here and begging for love that's of pain for the sake of a little pleasure just won't work. All you have to do is say goodbye to those forests. It's a pretty strong statement at the end, you know. Okay, I want to know something. I mean, there's a lot more one could say about this poem, but at the very end of it, let me just say this, because the modern editor of the text, who was a very great Tamil scholar, actually he was the last of the truly universal Tamil scholars. His name was Gopal Iyer. He died about 10 or 15 years ago. He edited this text, first of all, the Modern Alankaram. These books, by the way, Modern Alankaram, they've been more or less forgotten. Hardly anybody reads these books anymore. But he edited this book, and he also wrote a kind of commentary. And here's what Gopal Iyer says about these last line. He says, like that, like all of these things that we've just seen, it's not right for you to beg from me after creating so much suffering for the sake of a moment of pleasure. He, that is the Talaivan, he knows what he has to do, but he can't do it. He's withholding love, like the God. He's withholding love. So we have a kind of fifth moment. We have the two Ulurai Uvamams, we have the two upamas in the Dandin-like mode, and we have this fifth moment of, there's a kind of, I don't know what to call it, a kind of summary of the entire poem. And I think, this is my reading of this poem, you don't have to agree with me, but I think this is a poem about very intense loneliness, dissatisfaction, and waste. And we get this feeling, I use the word intense, because you remember I asked you just a few moments ago why the poet would want to combine these poetic systems in such a complex way, why he had to fuse them, or why he thought he should fuse them. And he tells us the answer to that in his grammar. It's a very conscious thing. He says, each of these systems alone has its power. But if you combine them, the, what should we call it? The texture and the tonality, the feeling, and the idea that is in the poem, embedded in the poem, is amplified and magnified at an almost exponential rate. And I think that's right. I think what the poet tells us in his grammar is correct. It's true. And all you have to do, you can do this at home, is to read it over again another time or two and see if you can find that element of a kind of profound expressive intensification. That, in a few words, is the history of the grammar of poetry in Tamil from the very earliest moment to what I think of as the early modern period, the 16th century. And needless to say, there's a lot more that we could say about it, you know. I'm really glad we had time to read this poem because it was fun to try to explain it to you.
Sir, there's a question on the chat box.
Sure.
Should I read it out?
I think you answered that question actually, but do read it. Do read it. It's about the mixing of Tinei actually. Just read it. Siddhika, read it.
Urural Uvamam in the second Sangam poem you showed. The question is from Janvi. Urural Uvamam in the second Sangam poem you showed offered a resonance that is contrasting. While the seagull-like bird was finding food for its pregnant beloved.
Oh, I see. It's in the chat. Is this the question that is in the chat?
Yes.
Yeah, from Jahnavi. Yes?
Do I continue?
Okay. Let me just look at it. Yes. Absolutely. What you say, I'll just read what everybody can see it, what Jahnavi has said, right? You are able to see it in the chat. You can have a look at it. She says very correctly that there's a contrast in the second Sangam poem. Two, you might say, opposing vectors of feeling. On the one hand, there's the love relationship and the spouse, the mate who is looking for food to bring to his beloved wife. And the other, there's this cold Talaivan who isn't coming and is ruining the life of the Talaivi. What does that mean? It seems to be a statement of the sort of complex subtleties in that relationship. Tamil poetry loves to do that. It only rather rarely settles upon a single, monotonal theme. It loves the shades and textures of the mixing. And you can see that that same kind of poetic technique, it, how should I say it, takes off into new levels of complexity the longer and the farther we go along in Tamil poetic history, like in the last poem we read, but it's also true in the Kamban poems, where you get mixed vectors. And actually, think about it, isn't that the way human beings usually are? I mean, we don't usually just feel one thing, a pure, rarefied, I don't know, romantic love without ambivalence or whatever it is. I mean, we usually feel all kinds of mixtures in different measures and different intensities. The poets aim to capture that. And the really striking thing to me, and this is what I hoped you would take away from this talk, is that the Tamil poetic grammar, as it evolved over time, allows them the means and the techniques to express those subtle feelings. It's an amazing thing, I think, and although other literatures, of course, have their own ways of doing that, there is something about this Tamil world of the Ulurai Uvamam and its relation to the other systems, which does allow for a very specific kind of poetic intensity.
So I had a question.
Please.
So when you were talking about the 5 Tinais in Agam poetry, you mentioned how the Kai Kilai, which is one-sided love, was also employed by the Bhakti poets in their poems.
Yeah.
Are there examples of religious poetry within the Sangam tradition itself? Because these poems, at least the love poems that, the translations that I've read, I haven't seen like an addressal to a particular god or...
Yeah. So within the Sangam corpus, if you include the entire corpus, yes, the answer is yes, because we have, along with the Yektitohai, that is the 8 main anthologies, along with them, we have a series of 10 poems that are called Patipati, the 10 longer poems. And they include the first one of them, which is called the Tirumurugatrapadai. That's a religious poem to the god Murugan. So if you think of that as a Sangam poem, it may be a rather late Sangam poem. It's a little hard to know. Anyway, I didn't want to even talk about this, but the dating of the Sangam poem is a big problem, and we don't really know. We don't have conclusive evidence as to when the poems were composed and which were composed first, and there's a lot of controversy about it. Someday we'll be able to resolve those doubts, but we will need more information. There are texts that have disappeared. Maybe if they turn up, there are different ways we could argue. But it's possible that that poem, the Tirumurugatrapada, is actually a little bit later. within the Sangam corpus itself, there are many references to gods. Especially, there's one other book I should have mentioned. There's the book called Paripadal, which again is supposed to be late. Paripadal, late means maybe 5th century or something like that. Paripadal, there are 70 poems of which only about 25, I believe, survived. The Paripadal are poems that are addressed to Tirumal, that is to Vishnu, or to Murugan, this Tamil Murugan, Skanda, Shanmuga. And they're religious poems, but they're not very much like the bhakti poems of the Arvars or of the Shaiva Nayanmar. They're a different type of poem. You know, there are some people who would say that the Sangam corpus, the Yirtitohai corpus of Aham and Puram poems, there are people who would say that these are secular poems. You could use a word like that. I'm not entirely happy with that word because I'm not sure what secular means. You know, before, let's say the, I don't know, late medieval, early modern period at best. It's probably not an appropriate term. But the idea of that word is maybe there in the sense that they're not denominational poems. You know, they're united by an aesthetic logic and an aesthetic grammar. And in that sense, they're not really like the Bhakti corpus that we see in the middle of the first millennium from the 6th century on. There, it's a different thing. You know. I don't know if that answers your question, Niranjana.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, okay.
Sir, I have one question.
Please.
Sir, you said that Ulurai Uvamam and Upamea and something like that. So I just want to know these terms came from Sanskrit to Tamil. I mean, is that correct? Because there is some sort of same terms used in Sanskrit poetics too, to understand comparison between things. I mean, the Upamaya and Upamam,
right,
and Upamit and something.
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question, and this is the right time to ask it after we've actually experienced you know, some of these poems. So it's good. We can now go back and talk a little bit about the history of these poetic techniques. And what you said is correct. First of all, even within the Sanskrit Alankara system of figuration, we do have a figure that is in some ways somewhat like Ulurai Uvamam. It's called Samasokti. Samasokti means a kind of combined statement, and it's always an indirect statement. You have an image of something, like, let's say, for example, say a poet says, you know, there's this tree, a big tree is standing there. It has lots of leaves and branches, but the leaves are drying up. And if you want to stand under this tree in the shade, you'll have a hard time finding shade. Suppose something like that. He would say it in a poetic way, he or she. That's Samasokti. That's an image which is meant to say, let's say some patron or some king who supports all kinds of poets and artists. He's actually drying up, and the poor speaker doesn't find any relief, right? That's Samasokti. And that looks a little bit, if you think about it, I mean, I just gave you a simple primitive example. It looks a little bit like Ulurai Uvamam. And not only that, within the Tamil grammars of the early modern period, sometimes they say that Ulurai Uvamam is a kind of Samasokti. You know. But actually, there is a difference between the two. I don't think that Samasokti normally, as we find it in Sanskrit, I don't think that it has the range and depth and resonance of the Ulurai Uvamam. Samasokti can usually, I don't know how to say it. I don't want to say it can be paraphrased. I don't like that. But the force of it and the meaning of it are more accessible than an Ulurai Uvamam, which is usually infinite. It goes on resonating back and forth, in and out, you know, forever. So although there's a kind of similarity here, we might say, in the technique, and anyway, I'm reluctant to make claims for, you know, the uniqueness of the Tamil poetic world. So I hear it every day. I mean, everything in life is unique, absolutely everything. Tamil is no more unique than any other unique thing. So I'm reluctant to make these kinds of claims. But I do think that the technique of Ulurai Uvamam, as we find it in the old Sangam poems, is something which is very unusual in the history of Indian literature. However, let me say this, and this is why I'm glad you asked the question, Nahid. There is a body of literature which is kind of close to it, and that's the Prakrit poems that we find, for example, in Hala's Sattasai. So these are poems from the early centuries AD. And those Prakrit verses, I mean, there are all kinds of things there, but they are strikingly like many of the Aham poems. So much so that there are people who think, and I agree with this, by the way, that maybe both those Prakrit verses, and they came from the Deccan, by the way, they came from what is today Maharashtra and northern and western Andhra Pradesh, maybe Karnataka to some extent. Those Deccani Prakrit poems and the Tamil Aham poems, it could be that both of these poetic canons, let's call them, emerged out of many centuries of experimentation that go back as far as the Neolithic period or the Mesolithic period, where these Deccani poets, Deccani, it's important that this is a Deccan thing, whoever they were, and we have some idea who they were experimenting along these lines. We can imagine a kind of bardic poetry that predates the Prakrit poems and also the Tamil poems, but in a certain way maybe fed into both of these ways of doing poetry, historically speaking. So although, again, I want to say the old Tamil grammar, it has a specificity which we want to respect, I don't think it's what is called a unicum. It's not something which is totally isolated from other Indian literatures. It's not like that. And really probably needs to be read together with the Prakrit poems of the Sattasai. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, sir.
So when can you come back?
I can come back anytime. I love reading poetry with others anytime. Yeah. You can see my voice. I've lost my voice in the course of the last hour. So
yeah,
I have a kind of a workshop on Monday with the translation.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah. That's with us, in fact.
Yeah, that's with you. And I'll be happy to come again sometime. I'd love to come in my body and actually be there with you. And
Yeah, because there are several things. In fact, this connection, it never occurred to me, the fact that, Prakrit verses and Sangam poetry could be thought of that now that you say it, what could be more normal? But,
right. Yeah.
Absolutely. I can think in terms of absolutely, so that is one thing.
Yeah.
And the other is that we did not talk about, I think that there is an interface between, the epics, the Tamil epics and Sangam poetry in a similar way. I can only think of Madhavi by the beach and then crossing the mountain and all of that. So
definitely.
All of that is yet to be discussed between us. So we have that.
Madhavi on the beach, she sings Aham poems, but they're a little different than the classical Aham poems. They're a little different, and
so,
a little later. It's a whole different world in a way, but it's continuous with the older poems. So you're right about that.
So we'll make another date, maybe another couple of dates. I think we'll have to let you go on that. Yeah.
Thank you for listening
so
and for being with me and reading with me. I enjoyed reading with you. Good. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Ipshita.
We need to formally thank you, so we shall proceed to do that. Yeah. Go on.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shulman. It was very wonderful having you, and we can hope we get to meet you soon. And I'd also like to thank all the participants, and also the link for the feedback form and the certificate will be provided shared in the chat box. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Namaskar.
So we'll
Post the
stay in
certificate
touch.
link on
Yeah,
the
we'll be
chat
in touch.
box.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The
You have
links are
something
in
to
the
say?
chat box. Please, you can access it.
Oh, stuff's in the chat box. Okay, bye.
Yes.
Bye, ma'am.
Hey, acha, okay, before I leave, hey, Devaruti. There are people I haven't seen for a long time here, so I want to
Please
see
stop
them.
recording now.
Devaruti. Yeah, you stop recording. Do stop recording.